Well, good morning, and we're going to continue. This is week 3, and the final week, I believe, unless I discover another gospel in the next 2 days. That was a joke. I'm going to have to call him out today, huh? All right. This is week 3, final week in our sermon series on the story of Jesus walking on the water. If this is your first week joining us, a little bit of a recap and review so you know where we're at. So there's a story that takes place in the New Testament where Jesus walks on the water. And if you read through the whole New Testament, you'll notice that this story occurs in 3 out of the 4 Gospels. So remember, 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Many of them and many of the passages occur throughout. There are many stories that are told multiple times. And what we've been discussing throughout the course of this series is that each Gospel was written by a particular author to a particular group of people. The Gospel of Matthew, for instance, was written primarily for a Jewish audience, and so we see lots of references in Matthew to Jewish culture and heritage, and he says lots of things that only a Jew would find significant because that's his audience. And the Gospel of John is written to be a very theological book. He's not really concerned about getting things in chronological order. He's not concerned with details and dates or things like that. John is concerned with kind of painting this theological picture. And so what we find is when we look at a story that occurs in different Gospels, the story is told from a different point of view. Different details are put forth. Different details are highlighted and expanded upon because each of the gospel writers used the story to focus on different parts of who Jesus is. Now, this study isn't about, well, let's figure out which one is more accurate. It's not about let's figure out which one is right or wrong or better or worse. This is about what different pictures do the gospel writers paint for us through telling the story in various ways. And so each story has different details or different wording. Our text last week has a whole part of the story. Matthew has a piece that doesn't occur in John, and it doesn't appear in Mark, which is what we're going to look at today. So you'll remember our first sermon, we looked at John chapter 6. In John chapter 6, we discussed how what happens is the disciples come and they get in the boat, and at least some of them were professional fishermen. They knew what they were doing. They know how to row and how to sail a boat across the lake. And so they go out, and Jesus stays on the shore, and this big storm comes, and they're getting sloshed around and blown all over the place, and there's wind and there's waves, and it's the middle of the night, so they can't see where they're going. And Jesus comes to them, and in this scene, the only thing that John talks about them being terrified of is Jesus. And so what we talked about was how they're not afraid of the wind, they're not afraid of the waves, they're terrified of what Jesus is doing. And then the parallel to that, of course, is in our lives, we don't get afraid anymore of the ways that the world wants to hurt us. We get used to being objectified, we get used to being judged, we get used to being told that we're not good enough. We get used to being stressed out about our finances. We get used to living in a cutthroat economy. All of these things, we learn to live with them in the same way that a fisherman learns to live with a sea that wants to drown them. And so it's normal to us that the world wants to destroy who we are. But then, like the disciples, when God shows up and tries to do something different in our lives, to remove the storm, to put us on solid ground, and to help us, we push away from that because we don't understand it. Like the disciples, when Jesus shows up in our lives, so often we're terrified and we're tempted to run the other direction because the wind and the waves may be trying to kill us, but we understand them, and we're comfortable with what we know. Last week, we talked about the story of Peter. And so in Matthew chapter 14, there's this other part of the story where Peter walks on the water. And the disciple Peter was a disciple who often in the Gospels got things wrong. There's a point where Peter is the only disciple where Jesus says, literally, "Get behind me, Satan." He calls him the evil one because of something that Peter said. He's the only disciple to be rebuked so harshly. It was Peter who denied Jesus 3 times. It was Peter who cut off the ear of a guard who was coming to arrest Jesus, who responded in violence when Jesus wanted him to respond in love. And so all throughout the Gospels, we see these stories where Peter just messes stuff up. And so we're very tempted to take Matthew chapter 14 and do the same thing and say, oh, this is just another story of Peter not being good enough. Because what happens is, Jesus shows up and Peter says, Jesus, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. And he gets out of the boat, he walks to Jesus, and then he sees the wind, and he begins to sink, and Jesus has to reach out his hand and pull him up out of the water. So we look at that and we say, oh, that's another instance of Peter failing to do what he was supposed to do. But what we talked about last week was this. None of the other disciples even got out of the boat. It was Peter who, when he said, Jesus, if it's you, call me to come out to you, that wasn't a really weird way to ask. We talked about how it'd be kind of silly if somebody, if I'm in my house at night and I hear a noise and I say, if you're a cat, just say so, but if you're a burglar, say that. And I hear a voice that says, I'm a cat. I wouldn't say, oh, well, honey, it's just a cat, right? That's a silly question. Peter says, Jesus, if it's you, call me out there. And so if this is some imposter, all he has to do is say, it's me, come out. And Peter's fooled, right? But what he's actually doing is he's recognizing that Jesus is the only one with the authority over the wind and the waves, with the ability to not just say, Peter, come out of the boat, but allow him to walk on water. And so Peter steps out of the boat, and if it's not Jesus, he's going to sink, grab the side of the boat, and hop right back in. But he says, Jesus, if it's you, you can call me to walk to you, and it'll happen. And he says, you're the only person that can do that, and I know that if you call me to you, if you tell me to walk on the waves, and if I step out of this boat and I don't sink, I will know that it's you because no one else has that power. And that is an unbelievably strong statement of faith. Peter walks out of the boat. He walks to Jesus. None of the other disciples have enough faith to walk on the water with Peter. Only Peter does. And when he sees the wind, he begins to sink. And Jesus says, Peter, why did you doubt? And again, that's not Jesus being frustrated. That's not Jesus being angry. I used the analogy last week that my wife teaches violin. She has a recital, and some of the kids do well, and some of them don't. It's a great teaching opportunity. And I said, what do you think she says in the lesson after that? If a student doesn't have a good recital, if they fail to play as they're supposed to play, she says, well, what went wrong? And she, with that student, seeks to figure out what the issue was. Was it bow technique? Was it fingering? Was it the way they're holding an instrument? And she teaches them in that moment. She uses it as a way to see in their playing what's going wrong, which is what Jesus does with Peter. He says, Peter, look, you made an incredible statement of faith walking out here. And you made it all the way up to me, and you didn't sink. But what happened, Peter? Where was it that you failed on the water here, so that you won't do it again next time? Now, we never see Peter walk on the water again, but we do see Peter make amazing leaps of faith. I mean, he leads the whole church in Jerusalem. And these waves on the lake, I mean, he had the entire Jewish nation, he had Rome, he had everybody trying to kill him and kill the church. I mean, the church under Peter's authority was incredibly persecuted. But Peter, through the lesson he learned on the lake, led the church through it. Because he learned in this moment that when persecution comes, don't look at the wind, look at Christ. And he applied that to the rest of his life and became this cornerstone, this rock in the church. All right, if you weren't here, now you're caught up. This week, final message, we're going to be in Mark chapter 6. We're going to begin in verse 45. If you want to read with me in your Bibles, it'll also be up on the screen. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. So here's what I find interesting about this passage. First of all, there's a little bit in here that wasn't in the other passages, but it's shorter. It's not like last week, but there's one verse in here that when I first read this, it jumped out at me, and it was the reason we saved Mark for the end, because I wasn't sure what to do with it. But if you look down to verse 48, we're going to cycle back to this at the end, but I want you to be thinking about it. It says, "And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea." Last sentence, "He meant to pass by them." So this verse immediately jumped out at me. This is what's different about the Gospel of Mark, is that there's this little sentence where Jesus, it seems like his plan. So he sees the disciples, they're out on the lake, they're struggling, they're having a hard time getting across. He's up on the mountain on the side, and he can see all this happening. So he comes down off the mountain where he's praying, he walks out in the ocean, and his plan is to just walk right by them and meet them on the other side. It was confusing to me at first because I thought, well, why did he do it then? What was the point of coming off the mountain when he saw them struggling if he was just going to go by them? It seems to me like Jesus is kind of a jerk in this passage. Like he walks by, he has the power to command the wind and waves, they're struggling, they're feeling like they're going to capsize, and he's just like, they got it. Keeps going. That's his plan. We're going to come back to that. So what's interesting in this passage is this. Jesus in this passage is so incredibly intentional about everything that he does. And some of this language is used in the other Gospels, but Mark really brings it all together and really gives us this very specific picture that everything Jesus does in this passage is thought out. There's nothing that Jesus does here that's by accident. He's not just kind of seeing what happens. He's not letting things occur. He's very specific about everything that he does here. Now, we haven't done this yet. The feeding of the 5,000 occurs before this in all of the passages. We haven't looked much at it yet. We're going to bounce back a little bit today. So just to set this story up and so you know what's going on, Jesus goes out. There's this huge crowd. Remember, this is the story where he looks out at the crowd. He sees all these people. His disciples come to them, and they say, "Look, we're out in the middle of nowhere. It's getting late in the day. Everybody's hungry. There's all these people." He says, "You need to send these people away so that they can go get food." We're back in verse 36 of the same chapter. Jesus answered them, and he says, "You give them something to eat." And his disciples understandably are confused. He's like, "Where are we going to get the money to feed 5,000 people?" They're like, "Jesus, we're unemployed. All right? We are not salaried disciples here. They wander around. They're not working. They're living off offerings, right? They are not wealthy people." Now, how many people here, if I said, "Hey, after church, I've got 5,000 to 10,000 people coming over. Can you guys handle the food for that?" I mean, it's tough to do small group for like 40 to 50 people. When we do barbecues after church, we do potlucks because none of us are able to buy enough food for the 50 to 60 people that come to our potlucks. So how many of you, if I said, "Hey, no warning, like no time for a Costco run, but in about 3 hours, I've got 5,000 people coming over," you can feed them, right? Like that's no big. You can go whip something up. How many people think you could do that? And we've got some people in this church that can cook and can throw together meals at the last minute. I don't think even the best of our folks, if we put them together, could pull that off, right? I mean, that's a lot of people. But that's what Jesus says to the disciples. He says, "Hey, you feed them." They're like, "Dude, we got like $5. Are they going to like split a McChicken?" Right? And so then Jesus comes, he said, "Look, give me what you have." They've got 5 loaves of bread. They've got 2 fish. I'm like, "Look, this is it. See, like I said, we've got nothing." Jesus takes it. He performs a miracle. They distribute it to everyone. There's tons of food for everybody. It's this incredible, incredible miracle. And this is what happens. All of the people, they're obviously excited about it. It doesn't talk about it in this passage, but basically after that, they decide that they want Jesus to be their king. They want to just take him and force him into a political position, which is not where he wanted to go. And we read in the other Gospels that was Jesus' primary motivation for leaving. Now, there's 2 things that were happening in that feeding, there were two lessons that Jesus taught. The first lesson was for the 5,000, was for the multitude, that he was powerful, that he had ability, that because of his miraculous abilities, he had authority to say the things that he was saying. See, when Jesus performed miracles, one of the primary functions of that was to say, look, I have power, I have authority, you should listen to what I say. And so that was one of the messages, one of the morals of the story of the feeding was to the crowds to say, look, I have power and authority, I can help you and I can change your life. But there was a second thing that he was doing through that, and that was to teach the disciples about what it meant to be in ministry and be stewards of people. Because he said to them, remember, he didn't say, oh, they need food, well, bring me something and I'm going to do something really sweet, right? He said, no, you feed them. And so this was a teaching moment for Jesus. He said, look, you guys, I'm not always going to be here. When I leave, you 12 are going to be in charge of the entire church, and you're going to be responsible for feeding people physically and spiritually. You're going to be responsible for meeting people's needs, even when you feel like you don't have the resources available to do that. And so here's how it's going to happen. And he teaches them this lesson. He basically says, look, when you're trying to feed my flocks, when you're trying to be there for my people, and when you don't have enough, I mean, not even like feel like you had enough, like there's not enough resources to go around, like you've got 20 people to go see and you're exhausted and you're falling over, when you don't have enough, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take what you do have, I want you to bring it to me and let me multiply it to empower you to do the things that I call you to do. He says, look, if I call you to do something, if I call you to feed 5,000 people, bring me what you've got, I will work with it, and I will give you enough to do what I call you to do. He's teaching them a lesson about faith and about service. But they don't quite get it at the end, and he realizes that. He points it out at the end of our passage, where it says, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So he looks at them in this moment, he says, you guys aren't quite getting it. And he says, you know what, I need to spend some time with my disciples. And so he says, look, you guys get in a boat now and head out of here. It says immediately, verse 44 is, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Before that is, and they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and other fish. Immediately he made them get into the boat. So he feeds the 5,000. They take up all the extras. They clean up the meal. And he says, good, get out of here. He puts them in a boat and he puts them out on the lake. And the reason he did that was he was immediately trying to teach them the second half of this lesson. He said, look, I'm trying to teach you a lesson about faith, about trusting in me, about looking to me when you don't have enough. And you're not quite getting it, so on to round 2, and he sends them off. So he sends them off to begin setting up the process that's going to lead to them learning this lesson. Jesus then goes and he prays. He dismisses the crowd, so he gets the disciples out of here. Then he dismisses the crowds, gets them out of there. He says, look, I don't need you worrying about the people. Now you need to worry about yourselves. Let me send these people away. He then goes up on a mountain and he prays. He takes time to himself, he takes time alone, and he prays, we imagine, in large part for the disciples and for the lesson that they're about to learn. And then he's on the mountain, and he sees them in the boat. Here's what he does. The water, this story, like the feeding of the 5,000, has 2 messages within it. All right? The first one is for the crowds, which in a lot of ways is us. Right? Just as Christians in general, this is a good story for us. I often preach this passage out of one of the Gospels at a wedding. And this is one of my favorite passages to preach at a wedding, and here's why. Here's the message in 30 seconds. That when I bring a young couple together, when I send them on their way, I send them with Christ, and I say, look, you are choosing this morning to unite yourselves. My invitation for you is to also invite Christ into your marriage. And when you have Christ in your marriage, you are living your life with a God who does not just plow through problems, but he walks over them. That as you go through life as a married couple, there's going to be stuff that comes at you. You're going to have jobs lost, and you're going to have to move, and there's going to be stuff in marriage. Marriage is hard. But if you invite God into that, we don't just have a God who's strong enough to fight through our problems. We have a God that literally stands on top of them in authority and power, and that's the God that we invite into our marriages. That's the first meeting. You guys are getting lots of extra sermons today. First meeting. broad, that's for all of us. The second meaning is not just for this more broad talk of who God is, but it's a very specific message to the disciples. And here's what it looks like. So Jesus is coming to them. They've just been in this place where they were completely overwhelmed. They didn't know what to do. They didn't feel like they had the ability to accomplish the task at hand, and immediately get sent out onto this lake. And the lesson Jesus is trying to teach them is to look to him. It's, hey, when you're in a spot where you don't know what to do, bring what you have to me, let me work with it, and I will empower you to get the job done. That was the feeding of the 5,000. He immediately sends them out onto the lake. He knows the storm is coming. He knows what's going to happen. He knows the situation that they're going to be in. And when he sees them struggling, he says, this is my moment. This is the moment in which I can teach them what I need to teach them. And he walks down, and his intention is to walk by them. Now, why does he do that? We're coming back to this now. Again, it's unsettling at first because we think, man, God, if I'm having a problem, I would like you to come help and not just walk by, right? I mean, we think about like Jesus himself gave us the parable of the Good Samaritan, which talks badly about people who just walk by someone and help. That's the parable of the Good Samaritan. Guy's on the side of the ground, he's been beat up, and these Pharisees and these priests, they're supposed to be caring for people, but they walk by and they leave them on the side of the road. And when I first read this passage, I think, man, Jesus, you're kind of setting yourself up as not a good neighbor, right? That's where we immediately go. But think about Jesus' thought process here. He's trying to teach them this lesson. He's trying to show them that he needs to be the one that they look to, not to themselves. Not, as they talk about in the feeding of the 5,000, they say, oh, Lord, where are we going to get the money? They say, we don't have that much cash. And Jesus says, yeah, that's the problem. You're looking in your wallets, you're not looking in mine. He says, you're looking to yourselves, not to me. He says, so when you're in trouble, stop looking at how much you don't have and start looking at how much I do have. And so what Jesus does here is he walks by them, and he walks close enough for them to see, but only if they're looking. He walks by the boat close enough that they can see him, that they can call out to him. But he doesn't just show up, because he's trying to teach them to look for him. And so what happens is he walks by, and at first they think he's a ghost, and they cry out, and they're terrified. But as soon as they see him, he speaks to them, and he says, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And he gets in the boat, and the winds cease. So here's what he's trying to show the disciples. He says, look, this started with the feeding. When you don't have enough, don't look at what you don't have, but look at what I do have, and let me empower what you do have to make a difference. He says, when you're in the middle of a storm, when it's rough, when you're not getting where you want to go, when you're in danger of sinking, look around for me, and I will be there. He's teaching them to look for him. That's why he planned to walk by. Because he says, look, it's not always going to be obvious to you guys where I am. And I can't always just bust into your life and solve all your problems for you. If we're going to have the relationship I want to have with you, you need to learn to look for me. He says, if I'm going to make the changes in your life that I want to make, you can't just get distracted by all the bad stuff around you, because guess what? When you have bad stuff come in your life, it puts itself right in front of your face. When you have struggles, when you're facing hardships, it doesn't give you a clear view to see me 10 miles off. He says you're going to be tempted to be focused on the things in your life that are dragging you down. He says you're going to be tempted to just be overwhelmed by everything that's right here. And you need to learn to look through the wind, to look through the rain and the waves to see me. And understand that when you do that, and when you invite me into the boat, everything will be calm. Because I have authority and I have power. Here's what I realized about this passage. There is nothing in this passage that you can point to that is anything but Jesus teaching his disciples. When he tells them to get into the boat, It's so that they will immediately get out onto the lake to be put in an environment where he can teach them. Tells them to go out immediately so that they have the feeding fresh in their minds. He doesn't wait a day. He doesn't wait 2 days to teach them this message. His timing is perfect. He sends them out exactly when he needs to. And then he sends the crowds away so that the disciples are still thinking about the 5,000. They don't stay and send the 5,000 away themselves and kind of close the book on that circumstance and on that miracle. It's still in their minds. It's still fresh. They're still in that moment. And he sends the crowds out of the way. And then he goes up on the mountain where he can watch them, where he can look at them, where he can see what they're going through. And even when it felt, because they couldn't see him, even when the disciples felt like he was a long way off, he was still watching them, and he was waiting for the right moment. And he prayed for himself, and he prayed for them, and he was focused on what he was trying to bring about in their lives. And then he came down, and he walked on the water, and even though it seemed like he was nowhere to be found, even when it seemed like he was just ignoring their problems, he was still trying to teach them. You see, every moment of your life, everything that happens, every interaction with you and him, Jesus is trying to teach you something. He's always trying to bring you closer to him. He's always trying to give you a better understanding of who he is. The New Testament, if it tells us anything, it's that Jesus will work tirelessly to teach you more about who he is and more about who you are in him. So here's the question for us. Do we relate to Jesus in a way that we expect him to be doing that? Said another way, does your Christian life, do you look for him to relate to you that way? Because so often what we do is we say, all right, Jesus, you taught me a good lesson last week, and give me a couple weeks and I'll be ready for lesson 2 in maybe end of September, right? And we try to have this relationship, and we look for this relationship where we kind of learn one thing and then we just want to kind of live in that for a while, right? And we just want to experience whatever that lesson was and that stretching and that growth, and then we stop looking until maybe the next crisis or the next big thing. But you understand that Jesus is constantly thinking about the next thing he wants to teach you. He is constantly planning for how to make your life better, how to fulfill you more, how to enrich you more. He's not like, all right, man, that was a good lesson. I'll see you in a couple weeks. I'm going to go take a break. He's constantly trying to draw you to him. And so do you live your life in a way that you expect him to do that? Because if you're not, then you're missing out. That Jesus says, look, you're in this situation, and I've got something great to teach you about me in this situation. Look, I'm right here. I'm 50 feet from the boat. All you have to do is look left. Look left. Recognize that I'm here. I've got an amazing thing to teach you. I have an amazing way I'm going to help you. And we just keep walking. We keep sailing. We say, I learned something last week. How often do you leave Jesus standing in the waves by himself, ready to teach you something, ready to help you, ready to calm the seas in your life? How many times do we leave him standing there alone? Well, we fight ourselves, focused on what we don't have, focused on where we're inadequate, allowing ourselves to be stressed. Stress is not one of the fruits of the Spirit. Some of us like to pretend it is. God calls us to situations that can make us stressed when we don't rely on him. Stress is never the call. Turn your heads, look through the waves, see a God that wants to change your life, and allow him in.